On August 23, 1942, the sky above Stalingrad turned black. Not from the clouds, but from flames. Flames so fierce they consumed the very air. German bombers filled the heavens, dropping over 1,000 tons of explosives on the city below. Streets that once echoed with laughter were swallowed by a storm of steel and smoke. Men, women, and children vanished beneath the rubble, their screams drowned in the roar of collapsing buildings. But amid the ruins, a haunting question lingered in the choking dust. How far can the human spirit go when there's nowhere left to run? This is not just a story about war. It's a story about hell on earth. A story where entire armies disappeared into the ashes of one city. A story where soldiers fought not for land, but for a single ruined building, a single floor, a single room. By the end, over 2 million lives would be lost. And yet, from the fire and blood, something extraordinary would emerge, something that would change the course of World War II forever. Before we dive deep into this unbelievable true story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the ending of this story. And trust me, the twist in the final part will leave you speechless. On August 23, 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus began its march toward Stalingrad, Adolf Hitler's ultimate obsession. To him, this city wasn't just another target on the map. It bore the name of his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. Capturing Stalingrad would not only cripple Soviet morale, but prove German dominance to the entire world. But Hitler's arrogance blinded him to the one truth that every soldier on the ground would soon learn. Stalingrad was not a city to be conquered. It was a living nightmare waiting to consume them all. As the Luftwaffe unleashed its bombardment, the once proud industrial city turned into an inferno. Wooden houses vanished in seconds. Brick factories cracked and crumbled. The Volga River, the city's lifeline, glowed red from the reflection of fires that raged for miles. Soviet civilians ran for the riverbanks, desperate for evacuation. But even there, the bombs followed. Within hours, over 40,000 civilians were dead. The survivors, covered in ash and blood, stumbled through the ruins, no longer citizens, but ghosts of a city that refused to die. Amid the chaos, General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, received his orders. Not one step back. It wasn't a suggestion. It was Stalin's infamous Order number 227. There would be no retreat, no surrender. Anyone who abandoned their post would be executed. As Chuikov crossed the Volga to take command, the river itself was under constant artillery fire. The water churned with the wreckage of boats and bodies. Soldiers ferried across in small rafts, knowing that many wouldn't make it to the other side. When Chuikov reached Stalingrad, he found no city, only ruins. He later described it as a volcano of steel and fire. His men were exhausted, under-equipped, and outnumbered. But he knew one thing: the Germans would not have Stalingrad easily. As the Germans advanced deeper into the city, they expected a swift victory. Instead, they found themselves in a nightmare of close-quarter combat, a new kind of war where every building, every basement, every pile of rubble became a battlefield. The Soviets called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Street by street, room by room, soldiers fought with knives, bayonets, and bare hands. Grenades were tossed through holes in walls. Machine guns fired from shattered windows. Snipers turned the ruins into killing fields. One of the most feared of these snipers was Vasily Zaitsev, a young marksman from Siberia. Hidden among the debris, Zaitsev killed hundreds of German soldiers, including officers, spreading fear through the enemy ranks. His motto was simple: "For every German who sets foot in Stalingrad, I will take his life." Meanwhile, the Germans began realizing they were fighting more than soldiers. They were fighting an idea. The Soviets refused to yield, no matter the cost. Every time the Germans thought they had taken a building, Soviet reinforcements emerged from the basements, from the sewers, from the smoke. The city became a labyrinth of death. Corpses lay frozen in the snow as the first Russian winter crept in. Food was scarce, ammunition ran low, and yet the fighting never stopped. For months, the front line barely moved more than a few hundred yards. The Germans would capture a factory in the morning and lose it again by nightfall. As the battle raged, Hitler grew impatient. He demanded Stalingrad be taken at all costs. He didn't know that those words would seal the fate of his army. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army was deep inside the ruins of Stalingrad. They believed victory was near. But far beyond the horizon, two massive Soviet armies were preparing something that would shock the world. A trap so large, so daring, that it would change the course of history forever. By November 19, 1942, the winds howled across the frozen steppes outside Stalingrad. The German soldiers, now gaunt, frostbitten and hollow-eyed, dug deeper into their makeshift trenches, unaware that their doom was already in motion. The snow had begun to fall lightly, muffling the thunder of distant artillery. To the north and south of the city, something massive was stirring, something that would soon encircle them like an iron coffin. At exactly 7:20 a.m., the silence shattered. Over 3,500 Soviet guns and rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously, unleashing a storm of fire and steel that stretched for miles. The frozen ground trembled beneath the roar. German soldiers stumbled out of bunkers, dazed and terrified, as the earth itself seemed to explode around them. This was Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive that would trap one of the largest German armies in history. The Soviets didn't attack Stalingrad directly. Instead, they struck the flanks, where the German High Command had placed weaker Allied forces, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. They were poorly armed, undertrained, and unprepared for the ferocity that was about to descend upon them. Within hours, the Soviet armor smashed through the lines like a blade through glass. T-34 tanks rolled relentlessly across the icy fields, crushing everything in their path. Romanian soldiers fled in chaos, their defenses collapsing like dominoes. Communications broke down. Commanders were cut off. In some sectors, entire battalions simply vanished into the snow. By the evening of November 20th, Soviet columns from the north and south were racing toward each other, closing the jaws of a trap. German field radios crackled with panic. Reports flooded in of units being overrun, fuel depots destroyed, ammunition gone. General Paulus, still confident in Hitler's orders, refused to retreat. "Hold your positions," he commanded. But his voice trembled, for even he could see the writing on the wall. On November 23rd, just 4 days after the offensive began, Soviet forces from both directions met near the town of Kalach-on-Don. The trap was complete. Over 300,000 Axis soldiers, Germans, Romanians, and others, were now encircled in what would forever be known as the Stalingrad Pocket. Inside the pocket, the horror began to unfold. Supplies dwindled rapidly. Temperatures plunged below 30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers scavenged through the bodies of their fallen comrades for food and clothing. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Ammunition was rationed to the last bullet. Hitler refused evacuation. He ordered Paulus to hold Stalingrad to the last man. A Luftwaffe airlift was promised to supply the trapped army, but it was a cruel illusion. The planes that did manage to land brought barely a fraction of what was needed. Most were shot down by Soviet fighters or flak guns before they even reached the city. As December came, starvation and frostbite became deadlier than enemy fire. Soldiers' hands froze to their rifles. Frostbitten flesh turned black and crumbled away. Some soldiers went mad, whispering to shadows, staring blankly at nothing as the sound of Soviet artillery never ceased. And yet, despite the agony, Paulus clung to Hitler's delusion. He sent desperate messages to Berlin. Supplies running out, ammunition low, men dying by the thousands. The response came cold and unyielding. The Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad must not be abandoned. In the ruins of the city, Soviet soldiers moved from building to building, fighting block by block. Every step forward cost dozens of lives. The Germans, entrenched in basements and shattered factories, refused to yield. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival. The once mighty German Sixth Army, once considered the finest fighting force in Europe, was now reduced to fragments, starving, freezing, and surrounded. The Soviet army watched patiently as their prey weakened day by day. Then, on December 12th, a faint glimmer of hope appeared for the trapped Germans. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a relief offensive from the southwest. His tanks pushed toward the Volga with desperate speed, cutting through Soviet lines and raising the hopes of every soldier trapped inside Stalingrad. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. The sound of distant German engines echoed through the frozen plains, and Paulus's men dared to dream that salvation was near. But it was a cruel mirage. The Soviet High Command anticipated the move and unleashed Operation Little Saturn, a massive counterattack that crushed the German relief forces. Manstein's advance was stopped cold just 30 miles short of Stalingrad. The trapped soldiers heard the gunfire fade in the distance, their last hope fading with it. By the end of December, the reality was undeniable. The German Sixth Army was doomed. Inside the city, the situation grew worse. The starving soldiers began eating anything: rats, sawdust, even belts made of leather. Disease spread through the ruins. Frostbite claimed limbs. The dead were left where they fell, frozen solid, stacked like firewood. And yet Hitler's orders remained unchanged: no surrender. The Soviet artillery never stopped. Every night the city shook with explosions as shells tore through the wreckage. The sky was red and black, a constant inferno over a city that had become a graveyard. Then on January 10th, 1943, the final Soviet assault began. Over 7,000 artillery guns roared in unison, shaking the ground for miles. It was the beginning of the end. The German front collapsed almost immediately. Soviet troops surged forward, reclaiming one shattered block after another. The defenders had no ammunition left. Some fought with knives, others with their bare hands. By late January, Paulus and his officers were trapped in the basement of a ruined department store, their headquarters reduced to rubble. When Stalin's ultimatum arrived, surrender or be destroyed, Paulus hesitated. Hitler promoted him to field marshal, reminding him that no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. But Paulus had seen enough death. On January 31st, 1943, he surrendered his half of the city. 2 days later, the last German resistance in Stalingrad fell. The once proud Sixth Army was gone. Of the 300,000 who entered Stalingrad, only 91,000 survived to surrender, and less than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The city of ruins had swallowed an entire army. The Battle of Stalingrad, brutal, merciless, and apocalyptic, was over. But what it left behind would haunt the world forever. The course of the war had shifted. The invincible myth of Hitler's army was shattered. The Red Army was rising, and from this moment forward, the tide of war would flow toward Berlin. When the guns finally fell silent in February 1943, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a scar upon the earth. The Volga River, once shimmering under the Russian sun, was now clogged with wreckage and corpses. The ruins of factories, homes, and entire districts stood like the bones of a dead civilization. Smoke rose from the rubble for weeks, darkening the skies and turning daylight into twilight. The wind carried the stench of death across miles. For the survivors, both Soviet and German, the battle had become something beyond war. It was pure endurance, stripped of glory and strategy. Soviet soldiers, many of them just teenagers, stumbled through the wreckage with hollow eyes. They had won, but their victory tasted of ash. Entire divisions were reduced to fragments. For every step of ground gained, blood had been spilled in rivers. The German prisoners who surrendered were marched through the snow in silence. Their uniforms were rags, their faces gaunt, their eyes empty. Some had frostbitten limbs wrapped in dirty cloth. Others collapsed mid-march, their bodies left frozen by the roadside. Soviet soldiers looked upon them not with triumph, but with a numb understanding, for they too had seen what war could do to men. Inside what was once the Red October factory, Soviet medics worked tirelessly among mountains of the wounded. There was no morphine left, No proper bandages, no food. Men screamed for water, for mercy, for death. Nurses, some barely older than the soldiers they tended, tore strips of their own clothing to bind the wounds. The air reeked of blood, smoke, and rot. Marshal Zhukov, upon seeing the aftermath, simply stood in silence. Even he, a man hardened by years of brutal warfare, was struck speechless. The victory was total, yes, but the cost was beyond measure. Over 2 million lives had been claimed by Stalingrad, soldiers and civilians alike. No other battlefield on earth had devoured so many souls in such a small place. For the German High Command, the news was catastrophic. The radio broadcast of the surrender was met with stunned silence across Germany. Families wept openly in the streets. Mothers and wives of soldiers who fought in the Sixth Army clutched letters that would never be answered. Hitler himself locked himself in his office for days, raging and incoherent, blaming his generals, the weather, anyone but himself. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was shattered forever. But for the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became something else, a symbol, a city that refused to die. The people who had stayed, the civilians who lived through the bombardment, who hid in basements while the walls shook and their loved ones perished, were hailed as heroes. Stalin called it the turning point of the war. Yet even he knew the truth. Stalingrad was not merely a military victory. It was a resurrection bought with suffering unimaginable. And amid the ruins, stories of impossible humanity began to emerge. One Soviet sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, who had become a legend during the siege, walked through the wreckage of his former post, the factory where he had hunted German officers with deadly precision. He found his rifle buried under snow, still locked and loaded. He wept quietly, not from pride, but from exhaustion. "No one should ever have to live like this again," he whispered. In another part of the city, a young German soldier named Hans, barely 19, sat shivering in a Soviet camp, surrounded by fellow captives. His fingers were blackened by frostbite. His uniform hung in tatters. He remembered the first days of the invasion, when they were told that the Russians would flee within weeks. Now he looked out across the endless snow, wondering how a world that had once felt so certain could end in such silence. The prisoners were sent on forced marches to Siberia, thousands of miles away. Many never arrived. Disease, hunger, and exposure claimed most of them long before they reached the camps. But even in that desolation, some found strange companionship. Soviet guards sharing bits of bread, wounded enemies helping each other walk. In those frozen wastes, hatred slowly dissolved into the shared misery of survival. Meanwhile, Stalingrad's survivors began to rebuild. They had nothing, no food, no water, no shelter. But they had something stronger than fear: defiance. Women carried bricks in their bare hands, children cleared rubble, soldiers helped plant the first wooden crosses over the mass graves. In time, the city began to breathe again, though it would never be the same. As 1943 turned into 1944, the Red Army pushed westward. The momentum had shifted. From the ruins of Stalingrad rose an army with renewed purpose. They would not stop until Berlin itself was burning. For Germany, Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end. Every officer, every strategist knew it. After that winter, Hitler's empire was no longer expanding. It was crumbling. And the soldiers who once shouted "Sieg Heil" now fought only to delay the inevitable. But what of Stalingrad itself? Years later, when survivors returned to commemorate the battle, they spoke in hushed tones. The city was quiet again, rebuilt on the bones of its dead. Memorials rose from the ashes, statues of steel and stone, silent witnesses to what mankind is capable of, both in courage and in cruelty. The giant statue Motherland Calls still stands today, gazing out over the city, sword raised high, her face both fierce and mournful. And beneath her shadow, the truth of Stalingrad remains eternal. This was not merely a clash of armies, but a collision of worlds, where faith, pride, and endurance met the brutal reality of survival. For 6 endless months, men fought not for conquest, but simply to exist one more day. They froze, bled, and died for streets that no longer existed, for a city that refused to be erased. And as the world looks back now, decades later, one haunting question still echoes through time. Was it victory, or was it madness? Perhaps the answer lies not in the numbers or the maps, but in the silence that followed, when even the wind seemed to mourn. Because in that silence, amid the ruins of a city that swallowed armies whole, the world was forever reminded, there are no true victors in hell.